Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you to the 8th and final week of our 8-week series titled Celebrating Humor and Music. And I want to pause to say thank you to our staff. We've had all these wonderful guests at our college to do a symposium this week, and we've had to tape all these programs in 1 week, although they air over an 8-week period, and they're remarkable staff, and their commitment is beyond the call of duty, and we thank them. We're using the Chautauqua format on this series, and that is we bring scholars to our campus, and they are very knowledgeable on some famous historical figures, and they portray them, and so we do this in the Chautauqua format of these great people. And so today we're going to role play and invite to our program. First of all is Mr. Will Rogers, who was born on November the 4th, 1879, and lived to 1935. And Mr. Rogers was from the Oklahoma Territory when he was born and became very famous as an Indian cowboy of the Cherokee Nation. And he also was an expert writer and a rope twirler, and wrote many columns for newspapers all over the country, and was in Wild West shows and vaudeville, and also was a very popular actor in Hollywood. Mr. Rogers, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm equally pleased to have here, that was with us last week, but he's here to join Will Rogers, and that is Mr. Mark Twain. And as I said last week, he was a great humorist, satirist, writer, and lecturer, best known for Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, although he wrote many other things and lectured across the country. Mr. Twain, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, and Janelle will commence today's question.
Welcome to the program, gentlemen. We'll start with Mark Twain. Both of you, though, had connections with politicians, or you at least had opinions about politicians. Let's start with Mr. Twain and find out something about what you think politicians think of politicians.
Well, honest politicians are a wonder, and I have always encouraged honest people to go into politics because their honesty will shine forth in the darkness more than it would, in any other sort of business. And we have trouble getting honest politicians as public servants. It's very difficult to get a politician to go to Congress, for example, and stay bought. Changes his mind when he's there. But I've tried not to be too critical of politicians. It's hard. It's hard work to do, and we can be grateful in this country, thankful that we have no native criminal class as they do in some countries, apart from Congress.
And Will, what do you think about politicians? What are some of your
Well, it's
thoughts
kind of like
about
banking.
them?
It's kind of like banking. It's an almost inevitably corrupt profession. But a lot of people go into it. I've always tried to live honest myself, and I'm staying out of politics if I can. But I do know a number of these people, and I found that they're a wonderful resource. A lot of people ask me if I write my own gags. And I say, no, I just go up to Washington, drop in and see what the boys is doing, and I report the facts. Because they can do more crazy things without thinking than I can think up. But most congressmen that I've met, well, they're really just children that didn't grow up. And if you get to know them one at a time, they're usually okay. It's like we used to say about the Dalton boys and the James gang back when I grew up. They're okay one at a time. It's when they get together that they get to be kind of a menace.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, both of you. My question is a two-part question that I'd like to start with Mr. Twain. Both of you are writers, and you have written many things. Some things that you were famous for and some things that never made the light of day. But I want to ask you to kind of critique yourself and tell us what you thought was your very best work and a piece of work that you didn't think wasn't very good, but the public thought was a good piece.
Well, I don't know that it was my best work, but it was the work I liked best at the time. And that was a play based on a book that I had written with Charles Warner called The Gilded Age. And that play turned out to be enormously successful. I was making $9,000 a week royalties on the production of the play. So I got interested in writing plays. And I wrote play after play after play. None of them would act. I could never find a director that would direct one. But I was always hopeful that I would. And I wrote one with William Dean Howells, and the directors wouldn't even look at it after the first couple of pages. Playwriting is very difficult theatrical art. But it was one that I kept up all my life. I finally, very late in life, just a few years ago, sent one off called Is He Dead? I thought it'd be wonderful, this sort of thing, based on an author, an artist, based on an artist whose work was not selling. And it always sells after you're dead. So he arranged a very elaborate funeral for himself, and then his prices began to climb, and made a good play, I thought. But the man I sent it to for criticism sent it right back. He said they won't act. Someday it may get published, but it's in my desk in one of the pigeonholes right now.
And Mr. Rogers, what would you claim would be your best piece of work?
Well, I don't know. I've always been sort of surprised, that what I did has been as well received as it has been, because when I came up, I was writing the kind of material that had to be redone just almost every few minutes. I was writing gags to be in Mr. Ziegfeld's Follies and Frolic, and we did a show at 8 o'clock and a show at 12 o'clock, and usually it was the same audience, and so I'd have to go out between shows and buy some papers, because all I knew was just what I read in the papers, and I'd have to rewrite, stuff in between. And then when I started writing for the newspapers, well, pretty soon I was having to produce something every day, and it wasn't a lot, but I had to sit at the typewriter, and bang out a couple of hundred words every afternoon, just in time to telegraph them off. When you write like that, you don't think too much about great work, You just try to turn it out and get it off in order to fulfill your obligations. I think you got that, obligations, your commitment. And so that's a lot of the writing I've done. Now, in recent years, while I was traveling, I sent a series of letters. Actually, I'd been invited by George Lorimer at the Saturday Evening Post to do this, and I did, which we called the letters of a self-appointed diplomat to his president. And I don't know if President Coolidge actually read my letters or not. I don't think he considered me to be a terribly important figure, representing the United States. But I tried very hard to represent the point of view of the people I knew at home and what I thought they believed was important. And so I wrote them to Mr. Coolidge, and I hoped that maybe he would read them, although I didn't have any hope, that he'd think it important enough to govern them by. And a lot of people have thought probably I think that's too important. They believe maybe I'm sort of getting myself involved more than I should.
Did you ever meet President Coolidge?
Oh, yes. I've met him on several occasions. In fact, I know that he read at least a couple of my letters, because shortly after I returned to the United States, he was kind enough to invite me to the White House for dinner. And he was not there when I arrived, but his wife, Grace, invited me to sit in the kitchen and have supper. And eventually Calvin came in himself. He'd been very busy, probably listening to some of his real advisors, and we had a nice conversation. And we've had a good friendship over the years. I visited them just a few years ago when they were living in Northampton. They just built a new house in Massachusetts, and they're doing well. Mr. Coolidge was a hard man to know, because you couldn't always tell whether he was talking or not. He was kind of a tight chewer and a close spitter. He didn't move his mouth much when he talked. But that was, he was from New England, so that was what you'd expect.
In your lifetime, you didn't meet one another, is my understanding. Mr. Mark Twain, you died in 1910, and Will Rogers, you had a tragic death in 1935 in a plane crash with your friend Wiley Post in Alaska. But now, as we bring you back to 2007, here you are. And do you, either one have something you'd like to ask the other one or say to the other one, since it's your first time to really be together?
Well, I'm delighted to have an opportunity to meet Mr. Mark Twain. I remember seeing notices in the newspaper when I was in New York City about it was been 1906, 1907, and I was doing some vaudeville shows. I was sort of in and out of the city from time to time, occasionally at the Schubert Theater, and but I didn't talk to my audience much in those days, and I never thought of myself as as telling gags or being a humorist. Otherwise, I would have looked him up and tried to get some good advice. So I guess I'd like to have a little advice about, humor.
And what would you say to him, Mr. Twain?
Well, I would say that in our poverty, humor is the best weapon that we have against the assault of laughter. Nothing can stand all the shams and foolishness that are built up over the centuries to restrict our liberties. You can just destroy them, turn them into rags and atoms at a blast of laughter. Once you get people laughing at something, that'll bring it down pretty quick. And so it ought to be used carefully for a good cause.
And probably pick on the big guys rather than the little ones, because they've got troubles of their own.
They do. They do.
Well, either one of you, I know this might be something you'll be surprised to hear me say, but either one of you would have made a very good candidate, because nothing could be more powerful in a campaign than humor against your opponent. So, of course, that time has passed.
Well, I ran a campaign for president in 1928. I was the candidate of the anti-bunk party. It was a sort of gag that was put together by Life magazine. It was a humor magazine at the time. Went out of business right after the campaign, but I had a platform and wrote several articles. And the first plank in my platform was, if I'm elected, I will immediately resign. Because I figured, Mr. Coolidge had got it right. The best thing you could do in office was probably nothing. And if you could get completely out of office, then the government would work a lot better.
I see.
That was certainly true of President Grant. I was fortunate enough to publish his memoirs. And talk about going after the big men. I was invited, and I used to like to play with humor just to get it close enough to the edge where people might think something untoward was going to happen. And there was a big reunion of Grant's soldiers in Chicago one time, and he was the guest of honor, and they asked me to give a toast. And they asked many people to give toasts, but mine was the last one, and I toasted to the baby. Because President Grant, here I said, was a baby one time. And his whole effort and all his energy was going into doing what that baby often does, and that's try to get his big toe in his mouth. And I'm sure if the child is father to the man, that he succeeded. Well, they laughed harder than they should have laughed because they were so relieved that I didn't go just 1 inch further with that story.
A relief. One other thing I want you both to do, because you both have, in my conversations with you, had a fascination with words. And Will Rogers, will start with you about the telephone book and the dictionary. And then I know that Mark Twain has something today about words and being paid by words. So we'll start with you.
Well, I've always believed that you should use your own word when you write. And for me, because I've lived a pretty simple life, that's usually the short, simple word. I write a column for the paper. And I try to write it just the way I would talk to somebody. But I know a lot of other columnists, and I read Walter Lippmann, and I read Arthur Brisbane, and I read old McIntyre. Somebody like McIntyre, he uses a lot of big words. And he says to me, Will, you'd improve your column writing if you get yourself a dictionary. Well, I got one, but if you look up words, you take a lot of time, and you could write a good deal while you were looking up the word. So, and it's like the telephone book, if you needed to call somebody, if you didn't already know their number, you wouldn't want to use the telephone book anyway. So you use the word you know. The dictionary may have a word for it, or the Greeks probably had a word for it. But you've got a word too. And the nice thing about the English language is there's always a short word. And that's usually the best one for me.
That was true, certainly, of my mother. We had a little boy, worked in our family, Sandy he was, and he was the cheeriest, noisiest spirit you ever met. And he just would whistle and sing. And finally, I went to my mother and said, "You got to stop that boy. He's just driving me crazy." And she sat me down and gave me the best speech I ever heard, all made up of small words. She said, "Poor Sandy has been taken from his mother. He'll never see her again, this little slave boy. And when he's singing, I'm happy. It's when he's quiet that I'm afraid he's remembering." And that speech, all made up of little words, stayed with me. And his singing and whistling never bothered me since. And I like to use small words myself. I never use policeman when I can use cop, because I get 10 cents for cop, same way as I do for policeman. The short words pay as much as the long ones.
So in a lot of short words, more money.
More money, that's right. You can get more short words in a magazine piece.
Janelle Burke.
Both of you gentlemen, both Mark Twain and Will Rogers, were married, and happily so. Mm-hmm. So tell us, Mr. Twain and then Mr. Rogers, about your views on marriage.
Well, I was very fortunate in my marriage. My wife was not. I married up, she married down. I married into wealth, and she married into poverty. But I think, like my mother, she tried to reform me. I never will get reformed up to your average standard level, but it kept her busy, and she worked hard, especially around Christmas time. She didn't do any more than a contingent of soldiers and 30 mules couldn't do, but she got us ready for the holidays.
Mr. Rogers?
Well, Betty runs our outfit. Betty Blake is the name of the young lady that I met in Ulaga back before I took off to go to South America. And it took me a while to convince her to marry me, but finally she did consent. And we've been happy ever since. The day I roped Betty is probably the best roping performance of my life. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, our life's been just about perfect, or at least mine has. Now, I know... I'm about the only person out in California in the movies who's got the same wife that he went out there with. But I'm holding on to her. I know several men who I believe would probably be better husbands than I would be. But I can't imagine letting her go for any of them. And I think we need to value marriage. I think it's very important. In fact, if we would charge as much for pastors, preachers to marry people as lawyers charge for divorces, then we'd improve a number of the relationships in our country.
And you can go even further than that and say that that would help out since according to you, the lawyers are making money on the divorces and the pastors are not making any money.
Well, that's right. It would help the pastors a good deal. They'd increase their income, so that they'd be right up there with some of the columnists, I suspect. And that'd be a good thing. That'd be a good thing.
And just one further thing, Mr. Twain, I think you said marriage in moderation. Is that correct?
Well, we ought to drink in moderation, smoke in moderation, and I think not marry too often, and marry in moderation. So that was the advice I gave to some schoolgirls that I talked to recently.
Erna Reinhardt.
We talked about advice. And I just want to tap into your brain for a moment to have you share with us, what advice did you give your children?
Well, I would tell my children, to get all the adventure they could, but then I would hope I'd be in a position to rein them in a little bit. But I think it's true for all of us. We're not here very long in life, and so we need to get a few laughs, and we need to do the best we can at whatever it is we do. We ought to try to live honest, and perhaps set something aside for the next life, but not worry too much about what it is, because you don't want to be disappointed when you get there and find out. But beyond that, I think you want to live your life so that, whenever you lose it, and we'll all lose someday, that you'll be ahead. And that's how I've always tried to live my own life. Be honest and have fun.
Thanks, Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Twain?
It's not hard. It's not easy being a father with three girls, all of whom have much better education than you do. They know more languages. They know more about music. They know more about everything, especially about their father, than you do. So I remember one time Susie invited me to go to her college to lecture. And so I did. And she said, "Father, I have only one request, and that is that you not tell that story about that ghost story about the golden arm." Well, I promised her, of course not. If you don't want me to tell that story, I won't. I used to love to tell that story, but said that I wouldn't. And I got up on the stage, and I looked out, and there were all the smiling college students, and the only thing I could think of was the story of the golden arm. And so I started in on it. And then I saw one of the students get up and leave the theater. And I knew who it was. And afterwards, I went to her room, and she said, "You promised." I said, "I know. But it is your fault for making me promise. Had I not promised, I would have never thought of it. But I had to do that. It was not easy, I suppose, on Susie and on other girls. I remember one time Clara came home from a party. She was just thrilled to death. She had the best time in her life. There were a whole contingent of soldiers, handsome military officers at the party, and she danced with them. She was the only woman in the room. Well, I said, "You'll ruin your reputation that way." I was very protective of the girls, and I think sometimes they didn't appreciate it.
Mr. Rogers, you've had an incredible life, as Mark Twain did, and it was often said that, I guess you said to me once before that it was your publicist, that we call them publicists today, that 7 out of 10 Americans heard or read about you every week, either radio talk or reading your columns. And so because of that, you really did have exposure, and you were so well known. And out of all the experiences you've had, excluding your wonderful, family relationships, what was one of the most rewarding things that you ever did in relation to all of those incredible experiences? And you made so many movies, and you were listed in 1984 as the most popular male movie actor. What's at the highlight of that?
Well, I tell you, I don't know about the movies. Most of them are just different scenarios, But I think the thing that I've always enjoyed most is when I go out in the public and have a chance just to stand up in front of the folks and talk to them directly. And what I wish, but I guess it's probably kind of foolish to think about it. I mean, I've always liked to hope that probably a part of my recognition would have to do with my music. But, and this is a week when we've been celebrating humor and music, but nobody's asked us to sing. And that's kind of the way it is when I perform. Nobody really wants to hear the music side of my act. They want to hear the gags, and I guess they're right about that too.
Of course, we could always invite you to do that right here. And
well, Mr. Twain had said something this morning about his dear love for the spirituals, which have always been very close to my own heart as well, and. I was down in Fort Worth not very long ago. I was on a tour, talking to audiences the way I was talking about, and there was a fellow from the colored church who came over to me before I went on at the Coliseum, and he said, "Mr. Rogers, we'd love for the people in our church to hear you speak too." I said, well, we'll just come over there on one condition, and that is I'll talk for a few minutes, and then you folks sing for a few minutes, and we'll move back and forth. It was one of the most pleasant afternoons of the whole tour, and we spent over a month, traveling around. And we would. I'd talk for 15 minutes, and they'd sing for 15 minutes. We just almost didn't get there for the show that night.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And you said that he had a publicist.
Or an agent.
An agent, did you really?
There was a fellow who came to me about 1925 or 26. He said, Will, with your gift of gab, I believe I can sell you, to go around the country and speak. I didn't realize that he meant, somewhere different every day. And there were about 70 nights in a row, and I appeared over, for each of about 3 years that I was traveling, and I'd show up someplace in the evening and talk, and they'd put me back on some conveyance, and I'd go off again until the next night, and then we'd do it again. It was wonderful because I got to see the public,
Yeah. And
Well, Redpath did that for me, but I wish I would have had a more active publicist, and then I wouldn't have had to wear this white suit in the winter as well as the summer. But I think it's appropriate because it is the uniform of the Society of Purity and Perfection, of which I'm the only member eligible.
And so that must be lonely at times, to be the only member.
Yes, it is, but...
That's a burden you've carried.
Yes, but I prefer to be clean. When most people wear these dark suits, you could plant things in and grow.
On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion, and this series to conclusion. And ladies and gentlemen, in past weeks, you've seen these two wonderful people on different shows, but I do need to identify them. Dr. Doug Watson has been here to portray Will Rogers, and what a remarkable man he is. And we've had Dr. George Frein, who has been portraying Mark Twain. They're both scholars, and they're both wonderful, wonderful gentlemen. And we've had them here before, and I hope at some time in the future you can come back, because you're just incredibly informative, and humor is a great way to learn. And I don't know of any way, as you said earlier, George, to be more powerful than with humor and laughter. There's nothing that's as powerful as it is. And I know, Doug, that you're retiring this year, and good luck to you. And George is already retired, and some of you'll have more time to do these wonderful things. And also, I know you're doing all over Oklahoma because it's the centennial. You're talking to the students. So, ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week at the same time. We'll deal with another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.